If one man, without holding any public office, manages to gain access to the most powerful people in the world, if doors keep opening at the sound of his name, and if the truth remains buried in silence for years, then the question is not whether a crime occurred. The real question is, why did it take so long? Why were warnings ignored? And why did justice repeatedly lose its way? This is the story of a network where wealth, influence, and silence became deeply intertwined. This is the story of Jeffrey Epstein, and of a truth as horrifying as it was real. Jeffrey Epstein was not an elected leader. He was not the head of any government, yet his access was extraordinary. Finance, politics, academia, and royal circles all revolved around him in one way or another. This story matters because it is not just about one man. It is a history of abused power. It is a test of a system that claims to protect the vulnerable, and it leaves behind a haunting question. When influence rises above the law, where does accountability stand? We will not turn this story into fiction. We will only say what history has recorded: court documents, investigative reports, and facts that surfaced years later. Today, we begin from the inside, with silent signals, early warnings, and decisions that would eventually give rise to a global scandal. This journey is not easy, but it leads toward the truth. Jeffrey Epstein's story does not begin with privilege. He did not come from a famous family, nor did he possess an elite degree that clearly defined his future. At first, he was simply an ordinary young man, quiet, observant, and unusually cautious. In the late 1970s, Epstein became a teacher at an elite school in New York. There, he quickly learned one thing: real power does not lie in knowledge. It lies in relationships. He studied people, their fears, their desires, and the things they never wanted to say out loud. Then came the moment that changed everything. He entered the financial world without any clear qualifications. This is where questions begin, because Wall Street does not usually open its doors to outsiders. But for Epstein, it did. Gradually, his name began circulating in powerful circles. He called himself a financial advisor, yet his client list always remained vague. He did not display wealth. He displayed access, private jets, a private island, and relationships no one questioned. These were not the signs of a single successful businessman, but of someone who understood how to earn trust and how to weaponize it. Here, one truth must be understood. Epstein did not seize power. He borrowed it. Behind every introduction, every invitation, every closed door, there was always a powerful name. This was the foundation on which his world stood, a world where asking questions was considered impolite and silence was labeled professionalism. And this quiet beginning was slowly moving toward a horrifying end. When we imagine power, we imagine noise, stages, speeches, decisions that make headlines. But Epstein's power was the opposite. It was silent, invisible, and therefore more dangerous. He never tried to appear powerful. He made himself indispensable. He did not issue commands. He became a bridge between people. He made introductions, he opened doors, and in return, he asked for nothing. At least, not at first. This was his strategy, because true influence does not demand. It waits. Epstein understood what powerful people fear most: scandal, truth emerging at the wrong time, and private lives becoming public. He never spoke those fears aloud. He promised to protect them. That is why an unusual level of trust formed around him. People came closer to him not because they wanted to break the law, but because they felt safe. A place where no one asked questions, where everything was understood, not spoken. This was a form of power that left no trace, not in files, not in speeches, but in private rooms, informal meetings, and moments when someone thought, this will never come out. Epstein's real weapon was not authority. It was an agreement of silence, an unspoken pact in which everyone believed they were in control, while in reality control had already shifted elsewhere. This teaches a bitter lesson. Power does not always come from giving orders. Often it belongs to the one who listens, remembers, and at the right moment says nothing. And when power becomes so quiet that it cannot be seen, holding it accountable becomes almost impossible. That same silent power eventually turned into the system's silence. When power is quiet, the greatest test belongs to the system. And in Epstein's case, that test failed repeatedly. Warnings existed. Complaints were on record. Victims' voices were there, weak but persistent. None of this appeared suddenly. It was a noise that built over years and was deliberately ignored. The most painful truth is this: this was not a case of ignorance. It was a matter of choice: when to look, when not to look, when the law should move, and when it should remain silent. By the mid-2000s, law enforcement had evidence. Investigations were underway. Then came a turning point, a legal deal that restricted justice and protected powerful circles. The language of the system changed. Victims became cases, facts became complicated, and questions were labeled unnecessary. This was not the failure of a single prosecutor. It was institutional weakness, the kind that surfaces when law and influence stand face to face, and its effects do not remain silent. When a case is buried, a message is sent, not only to the perpetrator, but to everyone who is watching justice closely. For victims, this silence becomes a second punishment, because when a system refuses to listen, speaking the truth begins to feel like a crime. Here, we must ask a difficult question. Is the system truly blind, or does it only see what is easy to see? Epstein's case shows us that when powerful individuals are involved, justice does not merely slow down, it becomes selective. This was the moment when one man's story turned into a much larger issue. It was no longer just about Epstein. It became a question: who does our system protect? And that question leads us to the next part, where we look beyond the headlines to the real human beings. Headlines list names, powerful titles, famous faces, but they are not the center of this story. The center is those whose names are rarely read. Most victims were underage, no resources, no protection, no language that power listens to. For them, this was not a scandal, it was daily reality, one that changed the course of their lives. One thing must be understood clearly: exploitation does not always begin with force. Often it begins with trust, with attention, with promises of safety, and with the belief that the person in front of you is responsible, mature, and wants to help. This was the psychological trap in which victims were caught. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then boundaries blurred, and when the truth became clear, escape was already difficult. Victims spoke, some immediately, some years later, because trauma takes time, and silence often becomes a way to survive. We must also reflect on language. When we say victims, we compress human lives into a single word. In reality, they were students, they were daughters, they were young girls with dreams, whose lives are not defined by one incident, but that incident left a permanent mark. Their truth did not remain confined to legal files. It lived in their bodies, in their sleep, in their relationships, and in the question, will anyone believe me? This is where society's role emerges, because justice does not exist only in courtrooms. It exists in listening, in believing, and in deciding whose voice matters. If Epstein's story remains limited to powerful names, we lose the real lesson. This story forces us to lift our gaze toward those the system ignored first, and that human cost is the heaviest burden of this story. Justice promises us that the law is equal for all. But in Epstein's case, that promise broke again and again. In 2008, a decision was made, a legal deal that reduced severe charges. Prison time was minimal, punishments were light, and most importantly, many victims were never heard. This delay was not just about time, it was about priority. Because when justice stands between the powerful and the powerless, it is tested. And in that test, the law stepped back. This case reminds us that justice is not just a verdict, it is a process, transparency, and above all, equality. Years later, when Epstein was arrested again in 2019, public outrage was intense. This arrest was not just legal action, it was an admission of years of delay. Then came another void: Epstein's death, the sudden end of legal proceedings, and questions that remain unanswered. We must be careful here. Speculation is not history, but the fact remains that this death closed many legal paths, and for victims, another door was shut. Delay in justice is not just a legal issue, it is a crisis of trust. When people see that wealth and connections can alter outcomes, the moral authority of law weakens. That is why Epstein's case became more than one man. It became a symbol, an example of where systems fail. It forces us to ask, is justice measured equally for everyone, or does it bend under influence? Because when justice arrives late, or not at all, the damage is not limited to one case. It damages society itself. And this realization leads us to the final point, where the question is no longer what happened, but what we learned. With Epstein's death, one chapter closed, but the story did not end. The real questions remain exactly as they were on day one. Who knew? Who stayed silent? And why did the truth take so long to breathe? One distinction must be understood. The absence of answers should not lead us to speculation, but the right to ask questions, history never erases. Epstein can no longer stand in court, but the system that made him possible still exists. The same power structures, the same silent deals, the same belief that some people will always stand above the law. That is why this story is not only about the past, it is about the present. In a digital age where access is easier than ever and oversight appears stronger, yet accountability remains uncertain, Epstein's case warns us that danger does not always come from outside. Often it comes in trusted forms, as advice, as mentorship, wrapped in promises of opportunity. This story also teaches us that silence is never neutral. When silence is chosen in the face of power, it often becomes part of injustice. The question today is not whether another Epstein can exist. The question is, will we ignore the same signs again? Will we continue to mistake influence for competence, or retreat our moral boundaries in the presence of powerful names? The lesson is simple, but the action is difficult. Justice must not only be demanded, it must be watched, challenged, and above all, protected, especially when it is needed for the vulnerable. Epstein's story is not meant to terrify us, it is meant to wake us, so that the next time truth knocks on the door, we do not just hear it, we open it. This is not the story of a single crime. It is the story of a veil of power, a veil behind which the law blurs and truth slowly stops breathing. The name Jeffrey Epstein often leads the mind toward conspiracy, but reality is far more frightening, because everything happened in plain sight, near courtrooms, under the shadows of powerful names. This documentary story exists to show us how history is written, when influence speaks and conscience remains silent.